Hello and welcome everyone to the second episode of 2040 Talks. This time a drink with Preeti Mudliar, for me a tea to be specific. Preeti, thanks for being here. It's good to see you again, even if it's only over the computer screen.
Yes, I know. It's great to see you, Bronwen. And I wish we could meet in person and not really have the screen between us, but well.
Me too. Well, we'll figure it out.
Definitely.
Before I introduce myself and Preeti, I'd like to say a few words about this format and also the whole project 2040, and give you, the audience, a few relevant information, not only on 2040, but also for the talk today. So the 2040 Talks are a small live series of talks with some of the authors of our freshly printed and also digitally uploaded book. Here is the book. Initially, we planned the book launch at the Institute, but that of course couldn't happen. Otherwise, we would love to give away a few copies. But well, now this is a completely digital book launch, and these 2040 Talks are part of this. 2040 is also the name of the whole project that started as an essay competition beginning of last year. And there, researchers and thinkers were invited to think of ideas that, these ideas should have been utopias for a digital society. So a positive outlook in the future combined with our digital society. And we had 5 different categories where the researchers could hand in their ideas to, and that was love, live, work, rule, and learn. Yes. And the final book and also our website contains 13 stories written by 13 researchers that were selected in this process of the essay competition. And last summer, we were together, all of us. We invited the 13 researchers to Berlin, and then we spent a couple of days together with 2 coaches, and we were thinking about these ideas that came together and helped the researchers to write their stories in a way they haven't written before, I guess. But we will come back to this and can learn firsthand from Preeti about this experience in a bit. First, the quick information for you. The whole book can be viewed and downloaded for free from our website 2040.hiig.de. And you can also order it as book on demand over the platform called ePubli. And a more relevant information for now, this talk should take about 1 hour, and we will learn more about the story and also the research behind the story and the experience Preeti had with 2040. But I am sure I'm not the only one who wants to pose some questions to Preeti. So you as the audience, you should feel invited to participate in this conversation, and you can do this over Slido. And you should be able to access that link from wherever you're joining this talk. So there you can not only pose questions, but you can also rank questions. And then my colleague Anna will join this call and hand over the questions, the most popular questions from our community. My name is Bronwen Deacon. I am a researcher, a PhD candidate and project manager at the Alexander von Humboldt Institute for Internet and Society. And with me is Preeti Mudliar. She's an assistant professor at International Institute of Information Technology, Bangalore. She holds a PhD in communication studies from the University of Texas, Austin, and her research interests broadly centers around gender, infrastructure, and digital media using ethnographic method and analysis. Currently, her work is focused on people's acts of repair and coping following biometric authentication failures in the public distribution system in India. Preeti, this is the perfect transition to the topic of your story. So first of all, thank you again for joining, especially
Thank you for having me.
Because in India, I think it's 9 o'clock in the evening right now, huh?
It's 8:30.
8:30. So thank you for making it possible, even though it's quite late. And maybe you can just start with outlining your story in Mangal's New World for those who haven't read it, and introduce us to your main protagonist, Mangal.
Definitely. Thank you so much for that introduction, Bronwen. It's completely my pleasure to be here talking about my work and also talking about the wonderful experience I had with the Humboldt Institute. So my story in Mangal's New World draws from my most recent research work, which is to do with biometric authentication failures. And in my story, I describe the trials and tribulations of my protagonist, whom I've named Mangal, as he struggles to authenticate his fingerprints to successfully establish his biometric credentials. Now, it is necessary for him to do so because in the year 2020, the climate crisis hits really hard. And as a consequence, water scarcity is at its very peak. And hence, the government steps in to provide people with water, especially the poor and the vulnerable who can't really afford to pay very high prices for water, because now water is sold at humongously high prices in the market. And thus the government steps in to help the poor with their daily supply of water by dispersing water pills. But people can also get their water pills only if they are able to prove their identity through fingerprint verification, because that helps the government track the disbursement of pills. Given how precious water as a commodity is, there is a lot of black marketing, there is a lot of leakages, both literally and otherwise, because people are out to make a quick buck and there is a lot of corruption in the system. And the government feels that imposing a biometric authentication system would allow them to target water pills to the ones who would need it most, and also make the supply chain more efficient. Now, given that my protagonist Mangal earns his living through manual labor, he finds this insistence on a machine verifying your identity by reading your fingerprint very difficult to fulfill, because his fingerprints are worn out through constant work. So the machine can't really accurately read his fingerprint, and consequently he gets rejected often, which also means that his family and he do not get the amount of water that they really need to survive. Now, the need for water is very dire, not just to quench your thirst, but also the sheer range of daily activities that require water for us to accomplish them successfully is quite mind-boggling. And thus his family's very survival depends on him getting those water pills. But because the machine refuses to recognize that manual labor has completely eroded his fingerprints and thus the machine can't read him, he is unable to stake claim to what is due to him. And this is really the dystopia which Mangal inhabits. And it is a dystopia in where he has to constantly spend time scrubbing his fingers and grooming them, softening the hard calluses on his fingers just so that they can pass the fingerprint verification and he can get his pills. This obviously is quite a harsh reality to live by, in addition to the water scarcity. And it eventually results in Mangal developing, his body begins developing a reaction to all of these circumstances. He begins experiencing physical pain. He experiences a lot of anxiety because if I don't pass the biometric verification, how is my family going to get water? And things come to such a pass that one fine day, the physical pain that he experiences is so blindingly intense that, quite uncaring of whatever consequences he may have to face, he goes ahead and destroys the biometric machine in his village. And in the process, very unwittingly, he becomes the leader of a rebellion against the rule of the machine, because his act of destroying the machine inspires many others to similarly destroy the biometric scanners in their own villages. because the sense of oppression that people have felt about this insistence on only if the machine recognizes your fingerprint data will you even get access to water is quite oppressive for people to live with. And when they witness Mangal destroying the machine, they similarly become very emboldened and they go and destroy all of the machines in their particular village. And this is how the what I call the mutiny against the machine spreads across the country. And while Mangal is imprisoned for his act of treason of destroying the machine, eventually what the rebellion also does is it completely overthrows this rule of the machine that was imposed on the people. And that is when Mangal begins living in a kind of a utopia, because a new world order is ushered. And in this particular utopian world that Mangal inhabits, machines are very sensitive to human needs. There is almost a collaborative relationship between them. There is a lot of sensitivity and dignity in interactions and transactions between people and machines. And the entire value system of human-machine interaction transforms into what I like to call as humane-machine interaction, where machines are compelled to recognize, process, and address the plurality and diversity of the human way of life. And that is where my story ends, where I say that, and thus after that, Mangal experiences no pain in this new utopia that he lives in. So that is essentially what my story is all about.
Thank you, Preeti. That was very well summarized in a good amount of time. So
Thanks.
For those who haven't read it, they know almost all about the story now.
Yes, they do. I have almost said everything that is there to know about the story. There is no suspense.
No, but I would be interested now, because you say 2020 in your story is the dystopian part. Yes. And you do a lot of field research. How much is the 2020 of your story the reality of these people in India? And is this our present?
It is very much the reality of people in India, where, and I mean, almost everything that I write in my story is directly drawn from my fieldwork. The kind of things that I have recorded and observed in my fieldwork, both through observations and through interviews, is mainly about how oppressed people feel in their interactions with the biometric machine, because they have to accomplish this every month. It is not a one-time procedure. Once they are enrolled, so my research doesn't talk about water, it talks about food distribution for the vulnerable and the marginalized in India. So every month when they come to collect their food entitlements, they have to mandatorily pass biometric authentication, without which they will not get access to their food. So this is almost like a kind of a ritual that they have to complete every month. And biometric infrastructures inherently are vulnerable to a lot of disruptions, especially in rural India, where my research is based, because you need very good internet connectivity for a biometric authentication to be processed successfully. And the mobile internet connection in the villages that I do my field work in is quite poor. No matter which service provider you opt for, your signal is going to be very weak. And if the signal is not working, it means that you just have to either return another day or wait until the time there is decent signal for the machine to process your transaction. If the signal is working, it could well be that the biometric database server sometimes fails to work, which means that the entire system just comes to a grinding halt and no transactions can be processed. Or the point of sale machines, the biometric machines, the scanners, if they aren't working, if for some reason they are malfunctioning, which happens very frequently, because various things such as the scanner, which is made of a glass plate, breaks, and then it has to be taken to the district office for repairs. Until the time that it comes back, again, your food entitlements cannot be processed, they cannot be dispersed. So there are multiple infrastructures that need to work together for biometric transaction to be successfully authenticated and processed. And in the absence of that, it just leads to a lot of delays. It leads to a lot of repeat trips because people keep visiting the office until the time that they can process. And that is just on the infrastructure part. The other problem with biometric technologies is that it insists that your body faithfully reproduces the data that it had first submitted to the machines. And as in the case of Mangal, most of the people that I interact with and who are a part of the food distribution system in India are generally the poor, the marginalized, and the most vulnerable, for whom manual labor is the only means of livelihood. That is the only way that they earn their daily wages. And invariably, most of them struggle a lot in producing the kind of data that the machine demands as biometric information from their bodies. So you will often see when you visit these villages at the time when the food entitlements are being distributed, you will often see people speak about how anxious they feel because they say that the machine is also unpredictable. If they've had an easy experience of clearing the biometric authentication 1 month, it does not mean that the next month also it will be as simple, because sometimes the fingerprints just don't work. And you will often also find them very expansively reflecting on their lives and the meaning of their lives. And they'll ask you questions such as, why am I being punished for being poor? Or why am I being punished for being a laborer? Right? It's why is my labor not accorded that dignity? Some people wonder, is it because they are illiterate? And they feel that maybe because I'm illiterate, I really do not understand how the machine works. And maybe it is a mistake that I am making, which is why I'm struggling so much to accomplish my biometric verification. People also talk about how their sense of dignity and their sense of privacy is often violated because of this. Because traditionally we've understood privacy to mean things such as, personal data protection, misuse of personal data, or are there adequate safeguards to ensure that whatever biometric data you've submitted is safeguarded. But in my fieldwork, I saw that people have a slightly different interpretation of privacy, where for them privacy becomes more of a performative activity, because the biometric authentication process takes place in a very public setting, which means there would be often 20, 50 people looking on at you as you walk up to the machine, place your finger, and then the machine, which also has pre-recorded voice prompts, declares its verdict, saying that either your touch has failed or your touch has succeeded. So it's a very public spectacle, which means that there are numerous onlookers really looking on at what's happening. And if your touch fails, what a lot of people do is they just squat on the ground and they scrub their fingers in the soil, in the earth, and then they wash it with water. And imagine having to do this with 50 other people looking at you. So all of this causes them a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress, a lot of embarrassment, a lot of conflicts. And all of it is exactly what I've tried to capture also in the story that I have written.
Yeah, I can imagine.
It is very much a current reality of 2020. And I'm very curious to know how the pandemic has changed things. Because some states in India waived off the requirement of having to do biometric authentication during this time, but not every state has done that. So I'm quite curious to go back to my field site to see what's really been happening during the pandemic.
I think you managed really well to in your story to tell the struggles Mangal is facing. And when I was reading it, I asked myself, how would Mangal's problem change if they would be other forms of identification, like face recognition or voice recognition? Why using fingerprints if they're so vulnerable,
I think it's not just fingerprints. Perhaps all of these issues would have also been there, even if it was voice recognition, even if it was iris scanning, which is one of the most popular methods that the United Nations especially is using in places like Yemen and Syria in the aid disbursement process that it uses there. But this is not to say that one form of biometric identification data is any better than the other. The problem is actually arising in the fact that this has to be accomplished every month. So even if it were an iris scan, even if it were voice recognition, similar problems would have come about, right? Because the quality of voice also changes as you age. So this is not to say that fingerprint is necessarily the worst of every other biometric form of identification that is there. The problem really lies in having to do this month after month. So there have been many alternative solutions that researchers and activists have proposed. Like for instance, why can't you collect the biometric data on a smart card or on a chip, and all that the beneficiary would have to do every month is just swipe it. And that would also eliminate the need for only one person, the person who has the biometric data, to go and fetch it. Because if you allot a particular smart card to an individual, somebody could come on their behalf also and collect their food entitlements. So it is, while biometric technologies are inherently problematic in a whole lot of ways and raise a lot of privacy concerns, the issue with what I see in the way the infrastructure is set up is not really to say that one biometric technology would be better or worse than the other. It's just the mandate of having to accomplish this month after month in the backdrop of infrastructures that are really fragile and are not really up to the task of providing a very seamless experience to the people who are interacting with them.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying. Because in the story, it's like the main problem are his hands, but now you explained it's also the infrastructure from a machine that can fail, so that it wouldn't work even though your fingers.
Yes.
I just got a message from Anna that there's a question regarding Mangal. Anna.
Yes, hello Bronwen, hello Preeti.
Hi Anna.
So we have a first question from Pranita. I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly. And they are asking, why did you choose the name Mangal for your protagonist?
Okay, so there were a couple of things that I was trying to do with this story. And one of them was to examine this notion of rebellion and this notion of mutiny against the machine. Because while I wasn't very clear in my mind what kind of machine-driven utopia Mangal would eventually live in, the most immediate kind of utopia that I could think of was allowing them some kind of agency over the machines that were trying to really dictate the very survival, right? So in some way to give them a voice. And for me, rebellion and the idea of mutiny was very interesting. And I decided to name my protagonist Mangal simply because in Indian history, Mangal Pandey is a very well-known figure because he was the one who supposedly fired the first shot of rebellion against colonial British rule, which led to the 1857 mutiny in India, which ultimately failed. And the British were successful in overcoming that particular mutiny. But I did not want a similar fate to befall my Mangal. I wanted him to be successful. I wanted him to lead the mutiny very successfully. So that was my little attempt to play around with history, which is why I decided to choose Mangal. Another part was the original Mangal, who led the 1857 mutiny, was also a member of the upper caste Brahmin community, whereas my Mangal belongs to the Dalit caste. And another thing that I wanted to bring out through the story is the politics of touch, where within the traditional Hindu caste system, touch has rarely been a very neutral notion or a neutral concept. So by virtue of belonging to the Dalit community, Mangal's touch was something that was always suspect because the kind of professions that the Dalits pursued often had to do with, say, for instance, clearing of human waste or disposal of human bodies or working with leather. And all of these professions were deemed polluting, which means that their touch was something that the upper caste Hindus would seek to avoid. So touch had never been a very benign or a very neutral concept for people like Mangal ever. So when they hear that henceforth all of their water entitlements are only going to be routed through a machine which they had to touch and learn if the machine has authenticated them successfully or not, Mangal is already feeling very uneasy because he knows that nothing good can really come out of the notion of touch for people of his community, at least, because historically touch has been a very oppressive concept for them. So that also makes him very uneasy, and ultimately his fears are proven to be true. So that is the reason why I chose the name Mangal.
Very good. That has cleared now 2 questions I had here to ask you as well. So I'd like to use the opportunity to switch a little bit into the process of writing the story. And because I'm sure you wrote a lot of articles, books maybe on your field work, like in academic writing, but I would be interested in how you felt switching from writing academic papers to storytelling and using science fiction as methodology.
Right. It was an interesting process, to say the least, because I was operating completely out of my comfort zone. I gravitate naturally towards nonfiction, both by virtue of being an academic, but also even before I became an academic. Nonfiction was something that I have always been confident of doing very well. It is a skin that I wear very comfortably. I feel at home there. So fiction was completely uncharted territory. I wasn't really sure if I would be able to do justice to it. It was really helpful. The kind of environment that the Humboldt team created, the kind of interactions and conversations that I had with fellow participants in the workshop, the amazing support that we had in the form of the coaching that was provided through Timothy and through the other coach who was just so firm and so insistent that we put away all our technological devices and just sit and write. It made for a very memorable experience. I don't claim to have finished my entire story during the duration of the workshop because it was just such a fertile time to ideate and to just reflect. I was neck deep in fieldwork when I came to Berlin for the workshop. So I already I was immersed in a lot of things that were going on, and it was for me quite challenging to understand what kind of fictional framework do I give it to. And I do not really know how far I succeeded because I didn't really venture too far out from what I was doing. I was dealing with food entitlements. I just replaced it with water entitlements. So I wasn't too adventurous or too imaginative in what I was trying to do. But I think given the framework of what the project demanded from us, I think I did a reasonable job in trying to transform and take what I saw in my fieldwork into a fictitious story. And the process really helped in the sense that, we had Timothy ask us regular questions. We had him actually convert our ideas into sketches and show us how it would look if were he to storyboard it. So having this very attentive person ask you probing questions about, what is your character's backstory? How do you think he will react in a particular situation really helped me nail down a lot of details that I would have otherwise struggled with. And I was also very fortunate to explore research collaborations with other participants at the workshop and bounce off my research ideas also off them. So it was, I would say, a very fruitful, a very pleasant, and a very productive experience overall. being at the retreat.
Happy to hear that, Preeti. But would you then say utopian scientific writing was a contradiction for you in the beginning, and then you had to learn that it's not? Or how did you gamble with that?
Yeah, it definitely it was a bit of a contradiction, because for the life of me, I couldn't understand how do I transform this very real dystopia that I have been recording as part of an academic exercise into a utopia, because it just seemed like a dead end in so many ways. So what would even transform this into a utopia, and would that even be possible? So they were very practical. I was hindered by a lot of very practical constraints, because I couldn't bring myself to look beyond what I was actually seeing on my field. So that is definitely something that I struggled with a fair bit. And in fact, to talk about my writing process, it took me very little time to write down the dystopian version, the dystopian part of my story, because I was just describing things that I was seeing on my fieldwork, but the utopian part was something that I definitely struggled with. And as a methodology, what it did was it allowed me to reflect, and it forced me to think more about the politics that guides the ethics of technology design. So I also did a little bit of reading up on that, which also led me to concepts such as value sensitive design in human computer interaction. And that led me to also to Amartya Sen's work, which I actually used in the research paper that I published from the project. So it was definitely a struggle. One thing that I couldn't really bring out in my story, and which is present in my research, is that as a consequence of all of these conflicts that people are facing in establishing the biometric credentials, the adults prefer to pass on the responsibility of biometric authentication to the children. So I don't talk about that in the story because I did not really have the space and the framework to discuss that very much. But in my research, I found that unwittingly, children are also becoming entangled in the whole biometric verification process because their fingers are still tender and the fingerprints have not yet eroded with age or with labor. And the adults in their family just pass on the responsibility of biometric authentication to them. And as a consequence, a lot of children miss school because they have to stand in the line and they have to collect food entitlements from their family, which means that they almost miss 2 to 3 days of school every month until they are successful in finishing the biometric formalities. And when I was speaking to children, they also told me a lot of things, such as how anxious they feel when they experience failure. So when they walk up to the machine and the machine rejects their fingerprints, they experience a lot of anxiety because they don't know if they've done anything wrong. And they also get bullied by a lot of adults because if they are standing in line, the adult will tell them, let me get ahead of you. And they are unable to advocate for themselves. So there are some very unintended consequences that children have to face as a result of the very harsh conditions of biometric authentication that have been imposed by the government, failing which their families do not get food entitlements. That is not something I speak about in the story, but that is also a very important reality, which made it very difficult for me to envision utopia. But when you go back to read the politics and the ethics of technology design, I think I drew on that thread to present the kind of utopia that I have done in the story.
Yeah, very interesting. Anna just said there's another question, so I'll bring her in.
Yes, hello again.
Hi.
So we have a question from Isabella Herrmann, who's also an author of the 2040.
Hi,
hello, Isabella.
And she's asking, to what extent is the machine also a metaphor for the materialization of an unjust system? And is the story really about a machine or about social power in general?
I think Isabella is not very far from the truth. We could definitely make an argument that the machine is a metaphor for the social power that exists, because firstly, none of these people are ever consulted or even asked, or their context even understood before a system like this is imposed. So definitely you see social inequality right from the outset, where even once the kind of challenges that they face is recognized, there is almost very little done to alleviate it. They are expected to deal with it. They are just handed a fait accompli and said, this is what it is, now live with it, right? So in many instances, obviously the machine does become a stand-in and a metaphor for social injustice that is otherwise also prevalent, which denies them a voice, which denies them agency in articulating or advocating for themselves and presenting their point of view. Because if they say that, you know, I lose almost a day's wage just standing in the line here to collect my food entitlement, the response that they most often would perhaps receive from the administration is, you have to deal with it, right? I mean, out of 10 people, if there are only 4 people who face this problem, then so be it. If the other 6 seem to have a smoother ride, then the system stays. So definitely it is a material manifestation of a lot of inequalities that are already prevalent in society, which also brings me to what Amartya Sen says in his work, where he points out that when we are looking at the kind of systems that we design, we must not be assessing them only from their from an infrastructural point of view, only on the merits of the technology, but we also need to assess these systems from the point of view of the world that they create and how do people really experience those technologies. And he very potently makes this argument, especially in the context of hunger, because he says that the problem of hunger has always been a moral and an ethical issue for every society and every culture around the world. So therefore, the kind of systems and the infrastructure that we put into place to even resolve these questions cannot be away from the context of morality and ethics. So he makes a very strong case for looking at all of this from the lens of morals and from the lens of ethics, because otherwise you are doing nothing to really redress the inequalities that exist, and all you're doing is continuing to perpetuate them. Simply because people do not have enough agency and enough voice to protest against what is happening, which is why rebellion for me was a very strong concept that I wanted to employ, because it denotes an overthrowing of the existing status quo.
This leads me to a question that actually you posed to yourself, because we were collecting questions for open educational resources that are to come soon. And we use that question also to promote this event on social media. So I'm gonna ask you your own question now. And it says, is a rebellion against technology sustainable in a digital connected world? And you just actually said no, but that's the utopian you wrote for your story. But I think it's interesting to look at it also now, because a growing number of people are skeptical against digital developments. If we look at the crisis and examples like 5G or something, is there, in your opinion, any point of rebelling against digital developments?
I think we need to rebel against certain conditions that digital developments impose on us. This is not, it's not to say that you throw away all of the digital technologies and you need to rebel against anything to do with but it's merely to say that you need to be very mindful of the kind of conditions that you choose to create with technology. Are you being sufficiently attentive to creating a more inclusive world with the kind of digital tools that are at your disposal? Or are you just privileging a certain section of society for whom this may be convenient, right? And are you then trying to impose very unequal conditions on others simply because, as I said, they may not have enough agency, they may not have enough visibility to advocate for their interests, they may not even know enough about what to say. So I think the rebellion definitely needs to happen very strategically, very tactically against the conditions and what kind of conditions are being created by the digital technologies rather than against the digital as a whole. So that would be my answer to it.
To your own question. Very good.
My
sure.
own question.
There's actually another question that you posed, and I will ask you a bit later. But for now, I would like to hear from you if the utopia you created for 2040, is that something you would like to envision? Is it really a utopia you'd like to come to life?
Definitely. I mean, it does sound, I don't know if utopia necessarily equates to something that's unattainable, but it definitely sounds like a very good world to live in, right? Where you have complete control over your privacy, where your consent is sought at every step, where if you do not want to engage with machines, you are free to not engage with machines. Because in my story, most people choose to engage with machines because it's just a more faster, more efficient, and a more convenient way of life for them. But if they choose not to engage with machines, nobody is going to penalize them. They are not going to be outcasts. There are alternatives that are set into place for people like them. So that definitely sounds very utopian, where there is no sense of coercion and there is no sense of force. And you are free to choose with whom you would like to interact and for what purposes. So the kind of utopia that I've envisioned also calls for a collaboration between the machine and the human, which leads to a more humane world. So I would definitely feel that that is definitely the kind of utopia that I would like to inhabit. And also because Mangal feels no pain in that kind of a world, I would definitely advocate for that. Now, to what extent that we are able to translate that into reality is a completely different question, because we've been seeing so many instances of privacy concerns, especially in the context of the pandemic, where apps are being really invasive and governments are insisting that these invasive measures are required if contact tracing has to be successful. So I'm not exactly sure if we are inching towards utopia or sliding even further back into dystopia, given the conditions that we are living in today. But I think we can definitely continue to be optimistic, continue to advocate, continue to speak up, continue to lobby, continue to educate, continue to enlighten people about the ethics, the politics, and the morals of technology design. As a starting point towards creating or towards inching towards some utopian vision of living with technology.
One quick follow-up on that before before Anna will come back in again with the questions from the audience. So I would like you to draw a little bit more upon the machine avoiders, as you call them, because I'm still wondering, why do we need them only to have like the glimpse of freedom to decide between the both paths? Or why should they avoid machines? What is their reason to?
Right. So the backstory for machine avoiders in my particular fiction was that many of them were Mangal's comrades in the rebellion. And I wanted to be sensitive to the fact that they probably suffer the after effects of a lot of trauma that the machine had visited on them, because they lived through the whole period of being oppressed by these machines. And I don't imagine that all of them emerged from the experience unscathed, right? So a lot of them perhaps have post-traumatic stress disorder simply because of the very harsh conditions that the machine imposed on them. And I felt that it would be natural that given a choice, they would want to avoid anything to do with machines, given that they waged a very bloody war against the machines and overthrew the entire order. So that was my starting point to weave in the community of machine avoiders into my story, because I also clarify in the story that even though Mangal has a chance to be a machine avoider himself, he chooses not to do that because he feels that somebody has to maintain eternal vigilance against the machine, right? So that was also something that we say about democracy, that you cannot take democracy for granted. You have to be eternally vigilant about it. So for me, Mangal plays a very symbolic role in this story, right from his name to his caste, to even the enlightened approach that he takes after he emerges as the leader of the rebellion. He feels that somebody needs to keep a constant watch on the machines, and I will play that role, even though I would be happy not to do anything with them. So that is where the notion of machine avoiders really came from. All of them are traumatized comrades of Mangal who would rather not have anything to do with the machines, and I just wanted to be sensitive to their concern.
Yeah, and he would actually didn't want to have to do anything with them as well, but he has to in a way.
Yes, he decides to take that responsibility onto himself.
Yeah. Okay, so on to Anna. She says she has a question for us.
Yes, and the question fits perfectly to the topic you were just talking about, actually. So the person is asking, do you think that technology avoiders will always be able to find a place in our ever-changing digital environment?
I think we should make it amenable for them to find a place, rather than them having to see whether they're going to be finding a place or not. So as I say in my story, there is a lot of good to the use of digital and the use of technology, but not everybody may really want to do that. So, and they may have very legitimate concerns about why they want to be machine avoiders. So my question really is, are we doing enough? And are we really being imaginative enough to create alternatives, sustainable alternatives to technology, given whatever context and whatever circumstance there is? Because it could be a legitimate need as to why you do not want to interact with technology. So are we merely being lazy and not thinking hard enough for alternatives that can coexist along with technology, or do we just want to impose something across the board and call for standardization simply because that's going to make life more easier in the way we choose to administer public life, or in the way we choose to administer certain things? So essentially, are we as a society making space for the oddballs? And if we are not, then why not? Why do we deny people their freedom to be a certain way or to choose certain things when it comes to their interaction with technology?
Yeah, that actually fits quite well to the last question I wanted to pose that you wrote down, which says what design principles should be non-negotiable in the building of identity infrastructures. And then I would ask, okay, then are the machine avoiders something that are non-negotiable, because you need to include them in the system?
Yes, you do need to include them in the system, but is there only one way of building a particular system? Can there be multiple entry points to the system? These are just some of the questions that I've been grappling with, because if I go back to my own field work, it's been almost 3 to 4 years now since the biometric infrastructure has been imposed on the food distribution system in India. And over a period of time, because people have been, in some instances, there have even been starvation deaths, which has forced the government to take notice of the human cost to to imposing a system like this. And in some instances, there has led to a certain loosening in the restrictions. So if you are somebody who repeatedly encounters failure in your biometric authentication, you can present your fingers to an authority who will examine them and who will certify them, saying that, yes, I have seen these fingers and these fingers are unfit to perform biometric authentication. So waive off this particular condition for them. for a particular period of time. Now, this has to be renewed periodically. It's not a one-time waiver that you get. But you do see that given enough pushback, the administration is forced to make accommodations and make changes, because the way they design technology is a one-size-fits-all solution, which clearly does not take place. So I think a lot of what we talk about about what should be non-negotiable should also be rooted in context, because what may be necessary and non-negotiable for, say, a food distribution system may not be present in a similarly intense manner in another context, say for immigration or say for land registration systems. So I think paying attention to context is of paramount importance, and that is also what the fields of, say, user experience or human-computer interaction would also urge people to think. And it will repeatedly tell you that you need to be very attentive to people, you need to be very attentive to their contexts, you need to be extremely attentive to the context in which they're using technology. So what I call as design principles for technology and what should be negotiable and what should be non-negotiable would in many instances be context dependent. You cannot just take one particular context and replicate that, because situations and circumstances will always differ, and so will the kind of people who need to make use of that technology. So my answer to that would really be pay attention to the context.
Yeah, that's also what you wrote in your utopian.
Yes.
Saying that everything should be in context, and then you can understand the person that comes up to you and tries to get food or whatever.
Yes, yes.
So Anna wrote me again for a last question, and then looking at the time, I will have one last question as well. And that was a quick chat then. Anna, first you.
Yes, I have another question by Pranita, and the question goes as follows. Along the lines of humane-machine interaction, what are your thoughts for addressing the excessive tribalism today in the virtual world?
The excessive?
Tribalism.
Okay, I don't know in what context she's asking the notion of tribalism. I would probably need more details on her particular question because I'm at a loss. I don't know in what context she's asking about tribalism.
Maybe read it again.
Well, no, I think she's only said tribalism.
Yeah, it's about the tribalism in the virtual world. That's what she said.
I think tribalism, I really don't know in what context she's asking this question. But I think where there are people, tribes exist. I think we very naturally look for similarities amongst the people that we choose to make friendships with and with whom we choose to collaborate and with whom we choose to have alliances. So I think whether online or offline, whether the real world or the virtual world, tribalism is a concept and is a notion that exists. As long as there are humans, I think there will be tribes. I don't know if that answers the question.
Okay, I will just ask my last question now already, Preeti. We're at the end of this talk.
Oh, wow.
It's a quite simple one, and I'm just interested in, because I said this is an experience in science communication in a way, right? So you're writing different kind of text, and you're possibly even reaching a different kind of audience. That's what is also our thought behind this project, of course. So my last question for you would be, who would you really like to reach with that story? Who would you like to read it and maybe learn from it?
I think simply because I'm coming from, because my story is so rooted in my field work, the one set of people that I would really like to read the story are the administrators who govern the food distribution system in India. I do not know if the story is going to make a difference in the way they perceive what's happening with the biometric authentication system, but I would hope for some sensitization to be generated through the story. I would also like for students of technology and students of digital design to read it, to understand the importance of context, to understand uh, the very oppressive circumstances that can be generated if you don't pay attention to whom you're designing technology for and for what purpose. Because hunger is a very urgent need. It is almost your survival depends on food. And if you're going to be creating such oppressive conditions that are going to be challenging people in their access of food, then you really need to rethink what kind of infrastructure you're really designing. So I'm hoping students would also find a story like this useful. But more than anything else, I think what an exercise of this kind of, actually writing fictitious science fiction that is still rooted in real world research, what it does is it seeks to simplify a lot of academic language and academic jargon that is so intrinsic to the kind of work that we as research scholars produce, which also makes it a little arcane and a little out of reach for the common person to grasp, to engage with, and to understand. So I would hope that converting it into narratives and into story forms, the way we've attempted to do with 2040, would allow our work to reach a broader audience and would allow us to communicate the concerns that we see in our research work to a wider public, which is very important for advocacy purposes and which is very important to generate awareness about the kind of topics that we talk about. So I think that is where the real value of a book like 2040 really lies in, because it seeks to make all of this more accessible to the general public.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think we all, and also you, we did a great job on writing these stories. Mm-hmm. So that's, for me, the point of, again, telling the audience where to find this book. Because of course, on our website, 2040 at hiig.de, you can download the whole book, also only some of the stories for free if you like. I, of course, want to thank you, Preeti, for this lovely talk. It was so good seeing you again.
Thank you for having me.
I think we all learned a lot about you, your work, and also about 2040. At least I did. I hope you had fun. And yeah, I think I can also say, or I don't think, I know that I can say that we have our next talk on the 19th of May at 6 o'clock, this time with Burkhard Schäfer. And again, in conversation with me. His story is called Digital Pharaoh. So go ahead, read the story in advance, then you know even more and can pose interesting questions and of course get the answers.
Definitely, so, I look forward to that talk too.
Yes, please join, Preeti. You can ask some questions.
Definitely.
You know.
Definitely.
Great. Thanks a million. I wish you all a nice evening at home, and Preeti.
Yes, definitely. And thanks to all the audience members who sent in questions and who attended this talk. Very thankful for your presence here.
Me too. Thank you very much.